By the expensive and very fashionable quayside in Barcelona, rich and very fashionable citizens pay homage to the city's eccentric genius, who was born 150 years ago. Every year, the brightest and best designers from home and abroad gather for the Gaudí fashion show, honouring Antoni Gaudí, architect and designer. Gaudí gave Barcelona a fairy tale park, a house of bones, a stone quarry, and a Disneyland cathedral. Today, in the fashion world, Antoni Miró is the city's favourite son.
I think Gaudí is the most important personality we have had in Barcelona. Barcelona has always had a tradition in architecture, and I think he was the most sublime. It's a different world. I think what's special about Gaudí is the fantasy that makes you dream.
Bimba Bosé is a top international model, hugely popular throughout Spain. She recognises the part Gaudí plays in her heritage.
It's like an explosion, no, of colour, and he's very unique. There's nothing in Spain like that, you know. Spain has been very, with Franco and everything, you know, it's been very harsh and very strong and very, you know, lines and everything like Madrid. And he's like a complete contrast with all of that.
All this for a shabby little man whose sharp dressing gave way to dirt and carelessness. A near recluse who fiercely guarded his privacy. We know little about the man, far more about his work.
Gaudí is more than an architect. Gaudí is a genius. Gaudí is a cultural icon.
Gaudí's works have stretched architecture to the edge of fairy tale. For some, he was the greatest innovator of all, in colour, shape and material. To others, he was a religious maniac at the pinnacle of bad taste. His unfinished triumph, the Sagrada Família, wouldn't look out of place in a theme park. Picasso mocked it. George Orwell called it one of the most hideous buildings in the world. But today, the tourists come in their millions, and for Barcelona, it's the symbol of the city. The Gaudí story is said to have begun in Riudoms, a little town in Tarragona, northern Spain. The Catalans are a proud people, and in Riudoms they are particularly proud that this is the birthplace of Gaudí. 5 miles away from Riudoms is the much larger town of Reus, where Gaudí was christened. There, they also stridently claim Gaudí's birth.
Reus and Riudoms, they're the ones that argue about Gaudí because they both have evidence to support Gaudí being born there. There's a real row going on here.
But for one Riudoms resident, there is no argument.
This was the house where Antoni Gaudí was born 150 years ago, in Riudoms. We know that is true because my great-grandmother was Antoni Gaudí's midwife.
The house is Mas de la Calderera, a cool retreat for the family on the edge of Riudoms. Gaudí's father, a coppersmith, had a workshop there. His son spent many hours watching and helping.
Modelling copper in his father's workshop, he learnt more about the 3D principles of architecture and about space than he ever learnt in the School of Architecture.
Gaudí needed the rural peace of Mas de la Calderera. He was a sickly youth who needed a lot of help. At an early age, he contracted rheumatic fever.
I think Gaudí's early years proved a particularly important stage in his life. He couldn't run. He could hardly walk because he had a problem with his knees. It was rheumatism. Then this illness converted him into a great observer. He put nature under the microscope.
The fruits of this observation were shown in his early drawings, which were all taken from his natural surroundings. When Gaudí was, at last, well enough to go to school here in Reus, he distinguished himself by failing his drawing exams. His education was a heady mix of religious faith and mathematics. When his health allowed, he journeyed 20 kilometres with 2 companions to the ruined Cistercian monastery at Poblet. Together, the 3 boys made a romantic pledge.
They decided, as the great kind of romantic gesture, as it were, to try and restore single-handedly this gigantic monastery. Of course, it's a kind of ludicrous idea that a 14-year-old should be able to do that, but it gives us a sense also already in youth that Gaudí is a man who has got ambition that sometimes runs beyond what is possible.
Crazy or not, the monastery was rebuilt in the end, with another of the friends playing a large part in raising the money. At school, Gaudí may have been odd and seemed older than his years, but by the time he arrived here at the university in Barcelona, the course of his life was set. Gaudí had firmly fixed on a career in architecture. He was quite choosy about what he would study.
He came to Barcelona and studied in the architecture school, but that many times he don't assist in the classes because he considered not interesting the speech of the professors, and he went to the library and consulted all the books.
He did go to classes elsewhere, which he thought might help him, philosophy for instance, but all this had to be paid for. So in his spare time, he took on drawing work for established architects. But skipping classes didn't stunt his progress. By 1878, he had graduated, got his first commission, and was quite the young man about town.
As a youth, Gaudí was very much a dandy figure. He had his gloves made at a special glove maker's, he had his hats made just around the corner here at Arnús. He even had his shoes broken in by his brother.
And with his brother, Francesc, the aspiring architect took rooms in Barcelona's medieval old town. But Francesc died, only 25 years old, and only a month or 2 before the death of their mother. Gaudí did find consolation in the nearby church of Santa Maria del Mar. Never short of confidence, he was soon recommending restoration work to the authorities. His suggestions weren't always appreciated. The ornate lamps in the Plaza Real were his first official commission, and even then he only got the job because the first designer died shortly after being appointed. Gaudí's work went down well, but the success was overshadowed by a row over payment, one of several during Gaudí's career. But around this time, Gaudí made the pivotal friendship which was to dominate his career. Eusebi Guell, a fabulously rich industrialist, provided the bankroll which allowed Gaudí to indulge his fantasies for the rest of his life.
He was fantastically fortunate, of course, in finding what every architect wants, a client like Eusebi Guell, who was one of the 10 richest people in the world at the time, and someone who was so utterly indulgent.
Their first big project was on the Guell estate at Pedralbes, or what was then the edge of the city. Gaudí was hired to do some restoration and to provide an elegant entrance, in keeping with the dignity of such a rich family. The result was the Guell Pavilion, a complex of stables and one of Europe's most grandiose porters' lodges, all in a Moorish style. It was the start of a great collaboration.
This relationship is very interesting because it's not a relationship between client and architect, by the friendship. It's a intimacy relationship with identity of thinking in Gaudí and in Guell.
And guarding the pavilion a figure straight out of ancient mythology. The dragon, Laden, protected the garden of Hesperides with the inevitable virgins and golden apples. The dragon was eventually killed by Hercules. But all this was just a taster for the first of Gaudí's spectacular projects. Amid the drab slabs of the city centre, an unexpected leap of laughter and lunacy. It was a typical Gaudí challenge, a rich man's palace in a tight space in a slightly dodgy district. Work started in 1885, and once again the paymaster was Guell, who wanted a family home to be proud of. No expense was spared, a motto which Gaudí was well able to live up to over the rest of his working life.
Guell's secretary, Pico y Campamer, came home and showed Guell everything that Gaudí had spent on the Palau Güell. Guell turned round and dismissed him and said, "Oh, is that all that Gaudí has spent?"
Guell got everything he paid for. A fantasy palace, bang opposite what was to become for a while a brothel. An eccentric extravagance which became a torturer's headquarters in the bloody civil war. Gaudí designed everything, down to the smallest detail. Even Guell's desk was a Gaudí speciality. The central hall is a microcosm of Gaudí's skill, almost a house within the house. A box-like square extending up and up, creating an illusion of space in a cramped area. But nowhere did fantasy become reality more than on the palace roof. In the middle of tenement blocks and washing lines, 14 weird and wonderful chimneys provide colourful and crazy monuments to the world of Antoni Gaudí. Not just a roof, but a fairy tale amid the city's squalor. It's the sort of paradox that tourists love.
He was a genius, he was a madman, I don't know. Well, Gaudí was a very religious person, and he designed this building like a staircase from the hell, the stables with the reddish color, to the heaven. We are now in the heaven. You can see there the sun, and over the sun, heaven. Okay?
By now, Gaudí was in his 30s. The dandy was giving way to the tetchy recluse. His detachment from normal life was reinforced by his one and only attempt at a love life. Josefa Moreu was red-haired, elegant, and a touch racy by Gaudí's standard. She might even have been divorced. But the repressed, nervous Gaudí plucked up courage to propose.
Gaudí, that's sure, was very shy. And when he decided to speak with that girl, the girl shows the ring that I am for another.
Gaudí's religiosity gave him comfort. His interest in women faded.
His relationship was with God. His interior life was rich enough not to need companionship in the way that other people need companionship.
The relationship with an architect and women can be love or sex, normally. Sex, in the case of Gaudí, I suppose, is converted in a sublimation of the things. He considered the stones, the architecture, as a kind of sublimation of sex. This force, this sense of violence that in sex, he transferred to the architecture.
Gaudí was on much safer ground with religion. His next project was for the order of Santa Teresa. Santa Teresa was austere and ascetic, much taken with medieval philosophy. Gaudí's building, offset only by a few Gaudí trademarks like the zigzag patterns, followed the austerity. It had to, as the money was scarce, and anyway, Gaudí was again picking up on work half done by someone else. His employers interfered rather too much for Gaudí's liking. He told one priest, "You stick to the sermons, I'll do the building." Gaudí was much more comfortable with Eusebi Guell as his client. Near Sitges, half an hour outside Barcelona, he built for his longtime friend and patron some bodegas or wine cellars, now converted to a restaurant. Above the dining room is a small, exquisite chapel, showing that for Gaudí and Guell there was a place for piety everywhere. His plan for the whole structure started with the tent-shaped roof. The next project was also driven by pious paternalism, this time at a radical new development just south of Barcelona. Guell may have been super rich. Some of his wealth, through his wife, may even have come from the slave trade. But he was still an idealist. At the Santa Coloma site, he envisaged a model workers' town, like Bourneville or Port Sunlight, where his textile workers would have superior housing and superior conditions for their families. As with all Guell's dreams, the church was at the centre of it, for the architect too.
The favorite work for Gaudí was the colony Guell church, because Gaudí uses the Guell colony crypt as the laboratory to explain his ideas in architecture and construction.
Gaudí, in terms of architecture, was a fantastically arrogant man, arrogant and ambitious. He had decided that all previous architecture had developed their types of errors. His most obvious example is that the Gothic style was not perfect because it needed the flying buttresses, and he talked about the flying buttresses as being the crutches which held up this fake or erroneous style.
Gaudí's answer was to use catenary arches to prevent roofs pushing their supporting walls outwards.
The best way of describing it is to see how a chain falls, and a chain falls in a natural catenary arch. If you then invert that, you get a form which is fantastically powerful.
Using this principle, Gaudí took a floor plan of the church and suspended it upside down on the ceiling. He used string catenaries to represent each arch and hung bags of shot from them to represent the building loads above. The weights distorted the catenaries into a shape that, once inverted, provided the correct shape for the arches to form a perfect load-bearing structure. This all had its drawbacks, though. Gaudí had used pork fat to grease the strings of his model, and the local mice took this as an invitation. Months of mathematical modelling were eaten before the results could be recorded. What's left is just the last frames of Gaudí's dream. He'd planned a big church dominating the countryside all around. He started at the bottom, and that's where he finished. The crypt alone took 15 years to build, and a sad and disappointed Guell died during the construction. To the modern observer, it all seems so fragile. You almost expect it to come tumbling down at any moment. The columns show off the obsession which was at the heart of all Gaudí's building. His yardstick was not to be found on the drawing board, it was in the very real examples of nature. His columns could be found in any line of trees. His use of colour was merely a development of the natural images he'd seen as a youth on his very doorstep in Mas de la Calderera.
He discovered that nature uses geometrical forms very useful, because during the history of art, many artists take models from nature, but especially for decoration. You can observe flowers and leaves in the capitals, or in the facade of Art Nouveau buildings, yes. But Gaudí said it's not only for decoration. Nature had enormous possibility for structural forms, because the best column is a tree. And the tree resists the wind, the snow, and continues growing. It's a very interesting structure. The bones in our skeleton are also excellent columns. The best dome is our head.
Gaudí's affinity to his natural surroundings probably explains one of the odder aspects of the Gaudí phenomenon. His work draws Catholic pilgrims in millions, not to mention the tourist hordes of Europe and America. But his most devoted followers are the Japanese. Far Eastern visitors are enchanted by the fantastical shapes and colours so far from the Gothic norm. The main explanation is that such naturalism would ring chords with people brought up with a Taoist philosophic heritage.
He is more concerned about nature. And actually we Japanese are more living with nature, I guess, but...
A more prosaic suggestion ties the Japanese interest to a 1970s advert for Suntory, a Japanese whiskey. The producers needed a European image to sell the whiskey in Japan. The image was supposed to represent the place of origin. But where was that?
It didn't matter. Scotland, Barcelona, it didn't matter. Just had to be Europe. And what image of Europe would have the most impact? They went for Park Güell. It could have been the Colosseum in Rome, it could have been the Hermitage, whatever. But it had to be an impressive image of Europe.
Japanese travel agents became well used to clients telling them, "I want to go to that place in the whiskey ad. I don't know where it is, but I want to go there." The place in the ad was in fact Park Güell, one of the key achievements of Gaudí's later years. By then, the mildly eccentric was turning into a rather irascible religious obsessive. But the obsession was to bear a strange and wonderful fruit. Sagrada Família.
Gaudí is not a normal man. He's an extraordinary man. He really is a genius, but not in the topical sense of the word. No, his passion for the life, his passion for the art, his passion for the buildings, the color, the volumes, the mythology, all these elements are concrete in Gaudí. Finally, Gaudí is one explosive cocktail.
Gaudí's imprint on Barcelona is seen everywhere, from street lamps and benches to the chapels and palaces of the rich merchants of the late 19th century. Gaudí was devout. Gaudí was driven. Gaudí was difficult. Gaudí was determined, but his achievements overshadowed his personality.
Gaudí was a very, very eccentric man. But like all geniuses, it's from that eccentricity that we get this wonderful gift of Gaudí's architecture.
Luckily for Gaudí, this eccentricity was not just tolerated, but positively encouraged by his patron, Guell, the paymaster behind most of Gaudí's great works. Perhaps their finest collaboration was the Park Güell, a large-scale madcap project which got its inspiration from the idealistic garden suburbs planned in England. Guell wanted a development of 60 houses round a park on a hillside estate. Started in 1900, like many of their projects, it was never completed. Most plots weren't sold, most houses weren't built. What was built, though, has won the affection of generations of visitors for over a century. It inspires wonder and laughter.
The children understand better Gaudí than architects or other professionals, because children conserve the innocence, the ingenuity. Yeah? And Gaudí was absolutely ingenuous all his life. He never lost his condition of a child.
Gaudí and Guell had a flight of fantasy in their dreams, creating a Greek marketplace which they fondly imagined would be used by traders and hawkers serving the estate. This was one of Gaudí's very few nods to classical civilization, although it got severely criticised as being quite unoriginal. Forming the parapet above the marketplace, the serpentine bench overlooks a panorama of the city. The tiles which form the mosaic surface of the bench were carefully broken up with a mallet and reassembled by Gaudí and his close colleague Jujol. Among other things, they used the Jujol family dinner service and china donated by another prominent citizen.
The mosaic is done by Joseph Maria Jujol, not by Gaudí. Gaudí was very confident in questions of colour. In Jujol, he had a kind of Picasso and mirror all put together.
In 1905, Gaudí decided to live on site, and with his invalid father and a niece, moved into a predictably distinctive creation. The little house is now a museum, with Gaudí's bedroom faithfully preserved. There are claims that Gaudí's mosaics contained secret Masonic messages, but the weird shapes in Gaudí's work led to suggestions that he used hallucinatory drugs. However, apart from the mushrooms on the fairy tale houses, there's little evidence.
Gaudí's work is like it is, not because he was high or because he was on drugs, but because he tried to recreate nature. And in nature, there are no straight lines.
Gaudí's affinity with nature extended to his diet. He was a strict vegetarian.
Gaudí was very unusual for his time, someone who even saw his food in terms of architecture. He loved dipping salad leaves into the milk because he claimed that the curved surface of salad managed to carry the milk in a better way than any other type of vegetable.
As well as a love of nature, Gaudí loved Catalonia. The country house at Bellesgard on the edge of Barcelona must have particularly appealed to Gaudí's Catalan patriotism. For a start, it was built on the site of another country residence, the 15th century castle that was the home of the last king of Catalonia. Built for the Sagrada Família, Bellesgard was specifically intended to revive memories of the triumphant past associated with the land. On top of the spire is the Cross of St. George, which itself sits on the crown of Catalonia, all above a series of walkways set into the roof that resemble one of M.C. Escher's fantasy pictures of staircases. They are supported by a series of delicate arches in the attic below. Bellesgard means beautiful view. These views confirmed Gaudí's obsessive prejudices, which linked everything Catalan with excellence.
Gaudí came up with some very lunatic ideas that only great art could be produced in Catalonia, that it was because the sun falls on Catalonia at exactly 45 degrees at a particular time of year, and which is perfect for a sculptor or an architect to understand volume, and that therefore it's only here that, of course, great art can be produced.
And great art was produced. The quintessential Gaudí appeared on the elegant Passeig de Gràcia in the form of what's been variously called a gingerbread house, a magician's home, or the local favourite, the House of Bones. The eerie frontage with its skulls and limbs, its spiky balconies and its dragon-back roof defies all fashionable convention. Gaudí was in one sense an excellent choice of architect for Casa Batlló, a man well used to putting up a palace on the architectural equivalent of a postage stamp. This was the project when Gaudí declared war against straight lines. There are very few of them. Then there was Gaudí's war against the local authority and its busybody planning laws. The elephant's feet at the bottom of his pillars encroached well onto the pavement. Illegal and a danger to the public, said officials. Gaudí fought back in the manner he had perfected. He totally ignored them and went his own sweet way. Then there was the war against Señora Batlló. This was a bit trickier. She was a stern, conventional Castilian from a family used to having its own way. The terms of engagement were soon settled. Senyor Batlló put up the money. Gaudí spent it. Senyora Batlló complained. Gaudí spent it anyway. It all ended up when architect and client parted company before the house was completed. But as striking and challenging as Casa Batlló is, there are smaller, more delicate treasures. The windows and their sashes, the fittings and the handles all reveal the way Gaudí combined unusual design with a ruthless sense of practicability. Luis Gilbert is an Argentinian artist who has become the foremost restorer of Gaudí's metalwork. He copies the originals, using wax moulds, making repairs or replacements as required.
This piece is one of the knobs that Gaudí designed. He designed different types of knobs and door handles in many varieties. All of them are designed perfectly for the hand and the fingers. He was thinking of each door and the relation of the weight of the door and the effort that a person had to provide to open or close that door or drawer.
Gaudí applied little effort when it came to client relations. He brooked little interference.
Gaudí was a man who always had the tendency to overreact. He used to say, "I could overcome everything in my life, except my bad character."
Gaudí was scathing about fellow architects, in fact about anybody who disagreed with him.
Gaudí is a very simple man with a strong character, and he is difficult. Gaudí and Guell permitted all the things to Gaudí, but not the others. He has fights with the other clients.
This was the case with the Milà family, who commissioned an apartment block on a corner near Barcelona city centre. Senyora Milà rather fancied something like this, or this, or maybe this. What she got was this. She wasn't happy.
Mr. Milà understands Gaudí. Mrs. Milà cannot understand Gaudí. It's two mentalities, and I think it's the same problem that we have today. It's the two interpretations about Gaudí. Anyone interpret Gaudí with a genius, extraordinary man, and others says that he's loco, is an artist, is a la folie.
The population of Barcelona soon made up its mind about Gaudí's latest extravagance. The Casa Milà soon became known as La Pedrera, the stone quarry. The middle classes took maximum offence.
I remember one family in particular. The father of the family said to the children, "Every time that you pass in front of La Pedrada, you have to do with your hand like this." Because they found it horrible, very bad, horrible, ugly.
Gaudí had his usual clashes with the local authorities. He exceeded the heights to which he was allowed to build. But as with all Gaudí's work, he had been altering it and developing it as he went along. Any original plans were well forgotten by the time the building was advanced. Senyor Milà and his wife had an apartment in La Pedrera, which is still kept as a visitor attraction. Once again, Gaudí designed all the furniture and detail, down to the coffee set and spiky architrave. Senyora Milà was so disenchanted with the project that she flatly refused to go out on the balcony. Pity, as she missed enjoying some of the most imaginative ironwork by Gaudí's longtime collaborator, Guell. The ironwork contributed to another of the fantasies surrounding the building. Even today, it seems like a barnacle-encrusted hulk, with the ironwork on the balconies representing the seaweed that was gradually smothering it. Gaudí characteristically paid special attention to the entrance, where the fashionable tenants would have arrived in their carriages. They too might have been forgiven for thinking that they had inadvertently strayed into the sea. In the first decade of the 20th century, this lift was water-powered. It took 10 minutes to ascend from the ground floor to the attic. This too has now become a visitor attraction. The brick catenary arches of the corridors in the attics give maximum scope for light and space. But the highlight of La Pedrera is above the attics. It is the roof. Gaudí's crazy chimney pots proliferate like a space invasion. The endless ups and downs of the walkways further disorientate the visitor. A detail on the roof of La Pedrera puts one of the Gaudí myths into some sort of perspective. The Masonic movement was vigorous in the Barcelona of that time. A number of Masonic messages are said to have been incorporated in the Park Güell tile work. It was thought that there was a clear example on La Pedrera's roof, the mysterious word rebled written on the tiling. The truth is less fanciful. Rebled was one of Senor Milà's employees.
He was working for Mr. Milà, who was paying for it all. He was his secretary. He dealt with the heating and things like that. I suppose that one day he was looking over the building and thought he'd immortalise himself in writing.
The roof proved Gaudí's undoing with the Milà family. This was a time of great political and anti-clerical unrest in Barcelona. One especially bad week in 1909 was known as La Semana Trágica. Churches were burned and the bodies of dead nuns were dug up by the mob and dragged through the streets. In this atmosphere, the devout Gaudí came up with the idea of putting a huge iron Virgin Mary on the Pedrera roof. Senor Milà understandably balked. They rowed. They parted company. Now Gaudí had had enough with rich merchants. He devoted the rest of his life to the one client who mattered to him, God. This was all very fitting. Gaudí had embraced religion early on, and his devotion had only increased in his years living in Park Güell. Now it was overwhelming. The yet-to-be-finished Sagrada Família, which has now become the picture postcard symbol of the city, was the brainchild of a devout bookseller. He and his fellow worshippers wanted a cathedral for the poor. Gaudí was not their first-choice architect. He began work in 1883, though, after the original architect was sacked.
The spirituality is present in the life of Gaudí. And we can understand in the moment that Gaudí works in this new cathedral for Barcelona, La Sagrada Família, Gaudí will present for God all the elements of his life.
The east facade took 50 years to construct. Gaudí was urged to spend a generous early donation quickly before the new Bishop of Barcelona had a chance to divert the cash elsewhere. Gaudí needed no second invitation. Without a single rich, obstinate and supportive sponsor, though, Gaudí began to get more and more dragged into the interminable efforts at fundraising. He doggedly guided party after party round the building site, urging more and more money out of them. Whatever the donation, it was never enough.
He said, but listen, this temple must be built with the sacrifice of all the faithful, everybody involved. And do you think that this amount you've given me is enough sacrifice? Come on, make more sacrifice. So they increased the amount.
He collected from door to door. The smallest gifts from the very poor were treasures to him. Once he himself was even mistaken for a beggar. By the 1920s, Gaudí's eccentricity had reached its climax. He had taken to not returning to Park Güell. Instead, he increasingly slept in a tiny room on the cathedral building site. He had fewer and fewer connections with the world outside Sagrada Família. Physically, he was a mess. He could still walk, though, the 15 kilometres each day to and from the church of St. Felipe Neri. He would doff his hat at the saint's bust and chat to the priest. This daily pilgrimage involved crossing the busy Gran Via, where he would wave his stick angrily at the trams, which annoyed him. On the 7th of June 1926, Gaudí was crossing the Gran Via, but not crossing quickly enough. A tram hit him, knocking him down. No one recognised the frail old man, and when at last an ambulance could be found to take him, they thought they were transporting a tramp, with his carpet slippers for shoes, underclothes held together with string, and pockets full of nuts. Even when he reached the Holy Cross Hospital, he was at first signed in as Antoni Gaudí, a mistake that was eventually rectified. But after only 3 days, Gaudí died. As if the citizens of Barcelona were guilt-ridden by the manner of Gaudí's death, hundreds of thousands of mourners lined the city streets. Controversies about religion, Gaudí's eccentricity, the excesses of his creations all died away. One newspaper proclaimed the death of a saint.
Aquest enterrament tan extraordinari de persones que van anar.
This funeral was extraordinary because of the number of people that went. Probably not everyone liked the architecture of Gaudí, but maybe lots of people, mothers, ordinary people, working class, factory workers, went because they admired the man, not because of any question of his art or of his works.
Gaudí's buildings are his legacy. 3/4 of a century after his death, work on the Sagrada Família continues, true to the plaster models Gaudí left behind. The only part of the cathedral not being built faithfully to Gaudí's plans is the west facade. It's being supervised by the veteran sculptor Josep Maria Subirachs. His own challenging passion facade with its green bronze doors is widely admired, but not always loved. According to Subirachs, Gaudí's work was visionary.
The main characteristic of Gaudí's work is that he brought to a peak the vaulted architecture that the Romans had invented. He brought it to its ultimate conclusion. And he was a man who, for the first time, used the collage that has been very popular in the 20th century. His esoteric shapes foretold abstract sculpture and the sculpture of the 20th century, like the figures of Henry Moore.
But the faithful still pine for the work of the master.
We can construct Sagrada Família with Gaudí or without Gaudí. But the genius of Gaudí and the spirit of Gaudí is not here. That is the difference.
The controversial cathedral probably won't be completed for another century yet. But as the building rises, so does respect for its pious creator.
His relationship was with God, and I see him very much as a lay preacher figure, as the saint of architecture.
Saint or no, Gaudí has left an unmistakable imprint on a city and its citizens. Today, millions come to Barcelona to pay homage.